Well, thank you. As you see, I'm glad our speaker managed to get here on time. Obviously, our speaker doesn't need much of an introduction, so I'll keep it very short. Professor Esposito is university professor at Georgetown. He's also professor of religion and international affairs and professor of Islamic studies, probably one of the most leading authorities on the study of Islam and politics in the world today. So we're very pleased that he can make it here. Unfortunately, as I already said, a very tight schedule. He'll have to give a talk down at the council later today, but he will be around for signing as we had hoped, and those books will be outside. The book that will be the basis of the talk today is The Future of Islam. Professor Esposito most recently is the author of a 4-volume series with Oxford on the study of Islam, and if you manage to get through those 4 volumes, there's another 30 books that he has written, so there's a sizable oeuvre for your enjoyment. Without further ado then, please welcome Professor Esposito to Northwestern University.
Thank you. I think that's the first time I've spoken in the United States where my name was pronounced correctly, my last name. We didn't even pronounce it correctly in my family growing up, so it's, but in any case, I'm delighted to be back here at Northwestern again. Although your weather leaves something to be desired. I left 80 degrees this morning at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and it was a shock to my system getting here. I want to talk about the book, and I want to start about, frame the book for you in terms of why did I write the book, and why did it turn out to be this particular kind of book. The book that I wrote is only about 40% of what I intended to write. This book was contracted before 9/11. And it was at a time when I saw developments moving in a slightly more positive direction, i.e., my book on the future of Islam was going to be, with a certain amount of hyperbole, something talking about the fact that when it came to Muslims in America, that Muslims had, after a number of decades, put their roots down, were becoming more economically integrated, and we know that now. We're beginning to become more politically integrated, certainly professionally integrated, and we're developing their institutions. And so it was going to be that the 21st century would, in a sense, be a century for the maturation and the development and maturation of what it meant to be a Muslim American. And globally, it was going to talk about what I thought would be both the pressures for change and the potential for change. I mean, not being naive, but just a realization, and this is before we had the Gallup data, that indeed at a popular level, there are across the Muslim world very strong sentiments for what I would call broader democratization, broader power sharing, rule of law, etc., and that pressure would be coming from below, even though it would attract more pressure from above. But I saw things moving constructively, and also potentially that would also mean a more constructive relationship between, I hate using these phrases, but the Muslim world and the West, the Muslim majority countries and Western countries. Well, then 9/11 came along, and that put that book on the back burner for 2 reasons. One, Oxford asked me to write a response, and being cute about these things, I thought, well, this is great. I'll take my book, Islamic Threat, and add another chapter. And they said, no, we really would like you to write a standalone piece that is a kind of response to the bin Laden phenomenon. And that was okay, because I said I didn't want to write a bin Laden book, because I thought that is not exactly what I do. And I thought one needed to present bin Laden in the broader context. So I wrote a book called Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam. However, in the course of writing that book, I got tracked onto another book, which was a Q&A called What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam. That book, I owe the idea completely to my wife, who suggested it. And it was a book that I did not intend to write. And in fact, I remember in frustration saying to her, well, I wrote Straight Path, and that's an introduction, and it's doing well. And she said, no, you keep complaining that when you deal with reporters and government people, they keep asking you the same questions all the time over the years. So, why don't you just do a Q&A? Because people have questions. They don't want to, and they want to be able to look and see the question that it's there and then find the answer and not wonder whether or not their question is even in your volume, etc. So I did that, but part of the reason I did both of those also was that I wasn't ready to face Future of Islam. I really didn't know what direction to go in. Make a long story short, when I finally got back to writing the book, it was the worst writing experience I've ever had in my life. It took me ages to finish the book. For me, I tend to get books out in a fairly timely fashion, from contract to getting the manuscript in, usually, I don't know, a year and a half, at least historically. Certainly no more than 2. And I did begin to find myself reflecting on the fact that years were going by. You know, I'd go off to an escape that we have, and I'd spend like several months there. And for the first time in my life, I had the feeling that I wasn't writing anything. I mean, I was doing something, but I wasn't sure what it was I was doing and producing. And it was just very hard to get a handle on it. And finally, what happened in the interim was that I then did another book with Gallup called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And then I suddenly had the idea that, okay, what I really want to do then is go back and look at the future of Islam in terms of issues that people were raising, not only before 9/11, certainly, and Muslims were dealing with Islamic reform, but certainly after 9/11, you know, what are the issues of Islamic reform? And what does it have to do with, for example, dealing with issues of religious extremism and terrorism, you know, what's happening out there? And also the development of Muslims in the West, but now the development of Muslims in the West in light of the aftershock of post 9/11 and also 7/7 in London and other attacks, and not only concerns about, if you will, whatever phrase one wants to use, homeland security, but also the growth of Islamophobia, the anti-immigrant right, etc. And then the third thing is the fallout from the Bush legacy of happy memory. Well, we don't know how much of happy memory, but that's another story that we can address in the Q&A period. So basically, that's where I wanted to go with it. One of the things that I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, and it depends on where you are if you follow this and what your politics are, but although I normally don't use this phrase, but I think we've gone through a period of what I would call both a battle of experts as well as a kind of, a Neo-McCarthy type era. What that has meant is not a free flow of ideas, high politicization, the not only shout television in terms of the way TV's adopted in terms of what is seen as kind of civil discourse, but even a kind of what makes things interesting is the debate, the fight. You know, I was recently invited to speak in South Africa. And so I wrote to a friend of mine. It looked like a really interesting invitation, and the guy looked interesting. But thank God for the internet, because then you go and check and see what does he really do beyond his credentials and see what he runs. And I got in touch with my friend, and it was clear that what this fellow wanted was the kind of Christians and Lions approach. You know, so you come out and you travel South Africa, but you set up, quote, what sounds civil like a debate, but really what it is, you know, a fight, a struggle. You know, it's sort of like when I was asked in D.C. to discuss the existence of God with Christopher Hitchens. You know, now is this going to be sort of intellectual discourse, or is it really going to be getting down and dirty? Not that there wasn't a little part of me that likes down and dirty, but I think that you sort of raise certain people up when you engage in down and dirty with them. And you see it on the internet. Post 9/11, the emergence of things like Campus Watch and a lot of these Jihad Watch sort of websites and et cetera. And the problem that I felt a lot of people have, and I see it both in government and in consulting with military and with general audiences, is what do you do in a world in which you now have a highly politicized world that writes about relations between the Muslim world and the West, a world in which really the theme clash of civilizations is very much alive, not that it means what Huntington means, but in other words, people have all senses of ways of talking about a clash in terms of culture, values, even people who dismiss or would say that they distance themselves a bit from Huntington. There was a piece in the Washington Post recently along those lines, which ultimately said, look, Arab-Palestinian really isn't the big issue It's really all about a clash of cultures and civilizations. And then you get that phrase that makes one want to get ill. If I were talking in Brooklyn, I would use a different phrase. And that is, let's talk about Sayyid Qutb. Well, so what? Did Sayyid Qutb died 50 years ago? We'll just keep trotting out Sayyid Qutb. We'll quote him and maybe Ibn Taymiyyah. And then we're off and running that this is really, at the end of the day, a clash of civilizations, even if we're avoiding the phrase. So what do you do with experts? You've got Bernard Lewis, you've got Martin Kramer, you've got Daniel Pipes playing Mr. Pretend. Then you have another school of thought that consists of a whole group of people, including myself. And so, you know, I liken it to during the cigarette debates when you would have Liggett and Myers hire a PhD from, I can say this now, Cornell. I make this up, but I did this at Cornell, forgetting I was at Cornell. It didn't go down too well. But, you know, out there saying, you know, I'm a PhD from Cornell, and I can tell you cigarettes are okay for you. And then you've got the equivalent PhD who may have also gone to Cornell saying just the opposite. Who do you believe? Well, on things that deal with the Middle East and the Muslim world, that's where we are. I'm dealing with a reporter right now with one of the top magazines, and she simply says stuff that are things that are empirically incorrect. But she's able to source them, but they are empirically incorrect. You know, she will say this movement was responsible for this attack, and I will say you look at any credible report, it didn't occur. But we're at that point. What many lawyers will tell you today, and then I'll get into the heart of the talk, but I've been involved in some legal cases, and you will get many lawyers who will say to you that in the American system today, Muslims are guilty until proven innocent. That's, and I would say at times in our culture. For example, if you read some newspaper statements in newspapers, if you were to take out the word Muslim and Islam and put in Jew and Judaism, or Catholic, or African American, an editor would think twice about printing some of that stuff. But now almost everything is believable. How do you address that? How do you address that world? And how do you begin to address it? Well, what I tried to do in this book is to basically pull off a lot of the perspectives that I've developed over the years, contextualize them now in, if you will, the 21st century and where we're going, and also dovetail them with some of the data that we have from Gallup and Pew and some other polls, but particularly Gallup because I know the Gallup data and I think it's still the most systematic and comprehensive, and I am associated with Gallup and I have far more access to that kind of data, and to try to put something out there. So in a sense then, the three foci of the book is to discuss what I see as the reality of Islam and Muslims at this juncture in history, in terms of the diversity of Islam and Muslim communities, the struggle for reform, or if you will, the struggle for the soul of Islam, to look at the question of the prospects of change. Who are the reformers? How do they differ from the past? What are their issues? How do they communicate their message? How effective are they? And then to look at Muslim-West relations. As I said, it's informed by the Gallup World Poll, which is a series of polls from 2001 to 2007, but the World Poll is 2007, 2008, and now we have a 2009, and that data is being compiled. The Gallup World Poll will be done every year for the next 100 years. I've never taken on a project that I have not seen till the end. So I will remember you all and visit your burial sites, but I will be here. Okay, so I took that data and I put it together. Now, when we talk about the problem of reform, to put the situation of reform in context, let me say that analogously, and you can ask me more about this if you want in the Q&A, I really do find, the more I'm in this field, that I find tremendous parallels between particularly Islam and Catholicism in terms of issues of reform. When you look at the issue of reform, how long it took Catholicism, for example, to come to grips with issues of modernity, democracy, free press, gender equality, a whole host of religious pluralism. Remember, Roman Catholicism did not accept religious pluralism officially until Vatican II. That's late 60s, early 70s. So pretty much latecomers to this process. So what do we see when we look at the Muslim world? Not surprisingly, and ultra-conservatism of many of the ulama, many of the religious scholars, okay? Now, why is that significant? It's not only because they are the interpreters of Islam historically, but they're also the people who give, many of them, the fatwas, the legal advice. They are also those that, in fact, influence, guide, and govern, if you will, the religious universities and seminaries and madrasas. Here, I'm not talking about extremism at this point. I'm simply talking about the fact that they promote a conservative theological worldview, much as pre-Vatican II, the Vatican was able to promote that, and much as post-Vatican II, we've moved back to a bit of that point under the current Pope. If you look at the new appointment for the Cardinal of California, what do you see? He's an Opus Dei priest. He's not just a conservative priest, but an Opus Dei priest. We're talking a very, very conservative, So you've got that configuration. Indeed, many would argue that Pope John Paul did many things that were notable, but among them, in terms of sort of historic, was, if I remember correctly, declared more saints than all other previous popes, which is not bad. And secondly, appointed by the end of his reign most of the people who are in cardinal and bishop positions, therefore able to influence a very movement to the right of the church. That then affects the seminaries, etc. So when we look at the Islamic world, we see this ultra-conservatism of the ulama. Therefore, we see the need for significant curricular reform in many of the madrasas and universities that train the next generation of religious leaders, scholars, students, and leaders. Also remember that in many Muslim countries, in the universities, not just in the seminaries, in the universities, when you do have religion courses, they're often taught by the ulama, or the ulama control those appointments. So it's like saying they control the theology departments, in Catholic universities, that is, to make an analogous situation. Then you have the challenge of effective delegitimating of militant ideas and ideologies. If you go to the internet and you look up Amman, A-M-M-A-N, as in Amman, Jordan, the Amman message, you will see a whole group of religious leaders that met in Amman a number of years ago and addressed the question of who's a Muslim, who's not, who can kind of push Muslims out, excommunicate, who can give a fatwa, trying to address, if you will, the bin Laden factor. The fact that people like bin Laden and those religious leaders that they can get to provide support wind up putting out fatwas. So how do you address and attempt to legitimate what they say and do and any sense of their authority? And then the final factor in terms of formidable obstacles are the political and economic realities in many Muslim countries that encourage the growth of extremist movements such as repressive governments, failed economies, cronyism, corruption, and social injustice, okay? And you see this in many countries. And just parenthetically, again, I may forget to get back to this, but what's a little disturbing is that in the last 6 months, this is being recorded, right? Okay, then I won't say what I was going to say. Is this Bombay Sapphire? Oh, okay. Now, let me move right on. Okay. One of the realities that we run into is that in a number of Muslim countries that we see as more pluralistic, there's been a falling back in some instances. Malaysia's had a number of incidents, Indonesia certainly, and then you have the I don't want to use the word vibrant, that can sound too positive, but powerful examples in a negative sense that have occurred at times in Pakistan and more recently in Nigeria. So who are these Islamic reformers? Who are these people who are trying to address this change? Interestingly enough, first of all, the reformers come from all walks of life. So it's not simply the idea that, well, it's just the, quote, clergy, the ulama who do this. Again, it mirrors a bit Roman Catholicism when you went from having the notion that to be a theologian was to study theology in a seminary, and therefore you went to a seminary to get the credible degree, and you were a priest, or you were a nun. Well, the fact is, we then move it to laity who get PhDs in religion or religious studies, and there's a tension sometimes between that laity and that clergy. for who are the interpreters, the religious authorities. The same thing happens in Islam. You've got clergy, you've got intellectuals, you've got now Islamic activists, both political and social activists. You have rulers and citizens, but interestingly, in particular, you have both traditionalist and, if you will, Islamic modernist. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example of some of these reformers to tease this out. On the one hand, you have somebody like Yusuf Qaradawi. Yusuf Qaradawi is an Egyptian, had a Muslim Brotherhood background, is no longer an official member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but in fact is in some ways the kind of advisor and godfather to the Islamic movement globally as well as to many Muslims. He's based in Qatar. He is a traditionally educated, global Muslim leader, and he is a traditionalist or neo-traditionalist in approach. Having said that, often Qaradawi and what we might call a more Islamic modernist type will use a different methodology to get to the same point as the Islamic modernist when it comes to, for example, the rights of women with regard to education, the rights of women with regard to holding positions in society, etc. So you wind up with a different methodology. What I mean by that is your neo-traditionalist will take the tradition. Now, what they mean by the tradition here, tradition has multiple meanings in Islam. But your neo-traditionalist will not simply say, I'm taking the whole tradition, as it were. The neo-traditionalist will, yes, talk about going back to the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. But what the neo-traditionalist is really going to be looking to is, in fact, those formulations of Islam that took place in the early centuries of Islam and that are embodied in the great law schools of Islam. The Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi. So they're going to look at the great religious scholars of the first 3.5 centuries of Islam, who in a sense developed Islamic law. So that's their place they're going to look at, okay? And that's going to become the authoritative base, okay? Raising an issue, one of the issues, and I'll come back to it later. This is okay. Traditions do this all the time. They look back to tradition. You talk to a Roman Catholic and you say, but that's not in the New Testament. They will say it's in tradition. And they will go back to some of the, the fathers of the church and their formulations. The question is whether or not you sacralize the tradition, whether or not you make it sacred, almost raising it to the status as a reference point that you would expect the scriptures to have. So the neo-traditionalist will deal with that tradition and figure out ways of dealing with it. For example, some neo-traditionalists will say, I'm not saying that what so-and-so said way back when was wrong. So-and-so said it in a different social context and therefore had a certain interpretation. So I'm not going to say that that was wrong. I'm just going to say that today we have a different situation. Okay, that could be very much a kind of Islamic modernist. But the neo-traditionalist will very rarely say that that was wrong on certain issues, you see. And in fact, the pull of neo-traditionalism can be seen, this is a bit unfair in a way, but it's a very concrete example in the argument with regard to whether or not women can lead the community prayer, the Friday prayer, the Jummah prayer, a mixed prayer, okay? You take a neo-traditionalist like Timothy Winter, who's known, well, he's known by that and also his Muslim name. But Timothy Winter is educated at Oxford and Cambridge, is a professor at Cambridge, also studied at Al-Azhar University. He is a convert to Islam, longtime convert to Islam, is a very prominent and skilled scholar and religious leader. And he has, I'll quote him on extremism and stuff, and you can see just how tough he is when he talks about the extremists and condemns them in terms of what he would see as traditional Islam. But when Tim Winter deals with the question of women and their ability to lead prayer, he will respond like almost a classical traditionalist and say as follows: there is nothing in the Quran that forbids it. There is nothing in the traditions of the Prophet that forbids it. But it is firmly grounded in the law schools, in the great leaders of the law schools and their formulations, has been held over the centuries. Therefore, one should not go back to the Quran and the Sunnah to reformulate. One should follow this tradition. Okay? Whereas your Islamic modernist reformer, you see, will say, in effect, you've got the Quran, you got the traditions of the Prophet, and then you have the Islamic tradition more broadly as it was developed and interpreted by the founders of the great law schools, by the great theologians like Al-Ghazali and others. And that needs to be a reference point, a major reference point for us, going back to that body of knowledge. But not only is it a case that some of it was a response and it was, you need to see it contextualized, and now we have a whole new context, or now we have whole new problems. But in fact, there are things that were said way back then that made sense in that context. But now, even though they were very much part of the tradition for so many centuries, one can move away from. Again, this is not all that uncommon, shouldn't be that strange to us. Reformers, again, I'll just use the Roman Catholic because it's easier. If I go into Protestantism, there are just so many groups, you see. Now, I won't give you a Catholic critique of that and why we're the one true church. I don't want to go there now because John Paul's gone and I can't become a saint that easily. Certainly not under Benedict. I don't have a chance. I'm going down. But anyway, that's another, oh, geez, I'm on tape. Oh, you want to edit that one out. I'm notorious for making statements, but that one is, yeah, that's good. All right. But the reality of it is that within Roman Catholicism and Islam, we talk about reform, and we have people who advocate reform. But for many people, when you have a long-held tradition, it's almost as if we lose a sense of the historic nature of that tradition. You know, for example, when people talk about celibacy in the church, for some of them, when they talk about a lot of different issues, of divorce and others, it's been a tradition so long that there's no sense of when it actually came in. People don't feel a need to say it came in this 2nd or 3rd century. It's like, this is a tradition. It's a long-held tradition. The last thing you want to do is touch that. Well, what happens then is that, therefore, even people who advocate reform will often be much slower to move into the kinds of reforms that need to take place. They're going to be much more comfortable with the more peripheral reforms. Okay, so getting back to these reformers then. Who are they and how do they function? Well, they function at a number of levels. They're people who, like Sheikh Ali Guma, are traditionally educated, but have a real strong modern sense of the world. Sheikh Ali Guma's first degree was in business at Al-Azhar. He's the Grand Mufti of Egypt. Yusuf Qaradawi, but also Mustafa Sherish, the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, who has a PhD from the University of Chicago. Did his first degree at Al-Azhar, but did his PhD at the University of Chicago. So, and if you actually study each of these people, as I do in the book, you will see how sometimes they come out in the same place, sometimes differently, but you can definitely see a difference in their methodology. There's definitely a difference in the methodology. Now, that's interesting for a variety of points. On the one hand, it shows that, you know, tradition, you can be on the spectrum religiously and on certain issues still arrive at what would be seen as a response to modernity that is sort of feasible. So this sometimes is forgotten by even Muslims who see themselves as progressive Muslims and often talk like critics of Islam and kind of say, you know, anybody who's not like me and is a Muslim is simply wrong. You know, so the conservatives, the traditionalists, etc., you know, we're really simply the cutting edge. So traditionalists can get there. On the other hand, it also can give one a sense of where the obstacles can come into. Because if nothing else, if you've got a traditionalist or a neo-traditionalist religious scholar, and he is dealing with a popular audience that's very conservative, he's also bound by the realities mentally. How fast can he take them? How fast should he take them? If you are the Grand Mufti of Egypt, there are positions that, if you did believe in them and you took them publicly, would simply discredit you. You know, might cause demonstrations in the streets, etc. So then you get that fine line of, you know, to what extent do you remain sensitive to that audience, and to what extent, as a reformer, do you push that audience? Your Islamic modernists are sensitive to the audience, but they're willing to push the envelope a lot harder. And yet they're very different on that spectrum. There's Tariq Ramadan, who will be coming to this area, many areas of the United States. This is the Muslim scholar and activist. He's currently at Oxford, who was kept out of the United States, accepted a chair at Notre Dame a number of years and was kept out for many years. And after a number of years and a successful ACLU suit, the government has admitted Tariq. Tariq is arriving in the United States, I think, this week. And his first event is at ACLU, and then he'll be at Georgetown, and then he's traveling across the country. On the other hand, there are people in Indonesia like Nurkolish Majid, a Chicago PhD, okay? Educated in the tradition in Indonesia, but Chicago PhD, intellectual Indonesia, but also involved in the political developments of Indonesia. When you look at a Tariq Ramadan, when you look at a Mustafa Sherish, when you look at a Nurkolish Majid, some of them use this wording. Nurkolish uses this wording. Some of them don't, but I would say they all engage in a very similar process, which again is, and this is where I see them more as taking the more, what I call Islamic modernist approach. That's the best phrase I can come up with, and it's not the best phrase. It's not the best phrase, but it's the best phrase I can come up with. And that is to say that, again, we have a tradition, and in a sense, our tradition is sacred. But the only thing that's sacred, at the end of the day, really sacred, is the Quran and authentic traditions of the Prophet. And our tradition, our broad-based, our Islamic tradition, okay, is a reference point, and an important reference point, but often historically and socially conditioned, and often, at times, wrong, okay? And it's that ability to say that. And so what they will, in effect, warn against is the sacralization of the tradition, because if you have a sacralization of the tradition, then it becomes very hard to engage in certain kinds of reforms and to move forward in an argument. For example, on apostasy and reinterpreting apostasy, or even at times on issues of gender relations. You know, if you wind up saying, as for example, Roman Catholics will say, well, the tradition is that women have never been ordained, you know, since way back when. And in Islam, you say, well, the tradition is that women have had this primary role and that other roles have been basically excluded, you know, or for whatever reason, there's going to be a real reluctance to then make the move to actually a substantial change. Again, whether it's women leading the Jummah prayer or whether it's women being ordained. I don't want to simply identify this particular aspect of Islam, but I think it stands out if one uses it as an example. What is also unique, though, about what's happening now is that it's not just, again, your muftis, and it's not just your intellectuals, some of whom I've mentioned, Tariq, Nurkolish Majid, and others who are not really formally religious leaders, but are trained in the tradition. But we now have a very strong popular preacher. In fact, the chapter that I have on reformers, I refer to it in the body, but initially I changed the title of the chapter because I didn't want to excessively offend some people. But initially it was looking for the Martin Luthers and Billy Grahams of Islam, which was my way of saying to a popular audience, looking for the major kind of counter-establishment, as it were, reformers and the tele-evangelists or preachers. Well, in Islam now you have tele-preachers. I use the phrase tele-evangelists, but tele-preachers. And that is, you have popular preachers like Amr Khalid, who draws audiences of tens of thousands, can pull an audience of 100,000 in the right place, who, according to some reports, his website gets more hits than Oprah Winfrey. Amr Khalid and Tariq Ramadan have been selected by Time magazine as among the sort of leading public figures in a particular year or decade or century, etc. So they're recognized in the West for the kind of audience. And so what's also come in here is the popular preacher, and I look at three of them. One, Amr Khalid for Egypt, the Arab world, and also Europe. He's also based in Europe now. A woman from Pakistan who's basically influential in Pakistan and in Canada in particular, but other areas, and then an Indonesian. But the preachers and the muftis, if you will, and others now take major advantage or have major access to mass communications. And what that means is not only audio and DVD and videos, but also the use of the internet and the use of TV. So now you have like Al Jazeera and on major Arab and Muslim communication networks, which are only relatively new, begun in the last 10 to 12 years, you now have networks that are watched throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and now these people have an international audience. They're like our telepreachers who used to say, Jimmy Swaggart, also of sort of happy memory, fell twice, at least as far as we know socially, went down hard, but okay, what can you say? We could even do a play on words on that, but I won't. But Swaggart, some of you will remember, like some of these televangelists, said something that's very true. And if you think about it, you know, he literally said at one time, I'm going to speak to a much greater audience than St. Paul ever did. You know, the idea with mass communications, you can deliver your message globally. That's phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And now what you have in the Arab and Muslim world, therefore, are people like Qaradawi, who has an audience throughout the world. And you have programs like, you know, the Mufti Speaks. And so people from all over the world can ask, you know, prominent religious leaders and get immediate responses. This is much different than the old days. In the old days, the Islam that most people knew was their village or their local Islam. They didn't even know their urban Islam, let alone their global Islam, you see. And so now you have this possibility of this incredible cross-fertilization across languages and cultures and schools of Islamic learning. And what that allows for is both, as it were, the more, you know, the kind of, if you will, the Grand Mufti, who's seen as the great religious authority but speaking to real problems, the intellectual, who's seen as the great intellectual, religiously knowledgeable person who speaks to problems, but also the popular preacher who's much more the grassroots person, okay? And yet, at a certain time, they can all speak to the grassroots to the extent that they're on TV, DVD, to the extent that people package their message for them, so that what Qaradawi may write as a scholarly text, he may then have a book that comes out that's written, he has a book that's a guide for Muslims in the West, for example, and is written, therefore, for a broader audience. Now, what are some of the key issues of reform? Well, I've picked out 5 of them. Democracy, Sharia or Islamic law, the status of women, terrorism, and religious pluralism. And we'll do all of those adequately in probably 6 to 10 minutes. Let's take the democracy question. One of the great frustrations in my career has been that I have the best job in the world and the most frustrating. As the way I like to put it is that I got into the field in the late 60s, early 70s, when nobody cared about Islam. My first job was not to teach Islam. I'm also trained I have a degree in Christian theology, and I'm also trained in Hinduism and Buddhism. So nobody wanted to do Islam in 79 when Iran came along. Now, so then I went from being invisible to very visible, you know, from being somebody who wrote 4 articles and got tenured to somebody who wouldn't tenure anybody, who only wrote 4 articles at this point in life and would expect far more from somebody who's publishing in my field. The reality of it is that the frustrating part of it is that despite the fact that there's been this boom in awareness of Islam, taught in our schools, available information in the media, Muslims far more visible. Some of you are old enough to remember a time when not only in rural areas but urban areas, one didn't even see a mosque or an Islamic center, you know, unless one stumbled across something kind of accidentally. Now that's all changed in terms of the skyline. And yet, I'm asked the same questions for 30 years. The same questions. Is Islam compatible with modernity? Is Islam compatible with modernization? Is Islam compatible with democracy? Is Islam a more violent religion than Christianity? Or to put it another way, isn't Islam obviously a much more violent? Isn't the Quran a much more violent book than the Bible? Usually said to me by Christians who have never read the Bible. Particularly if you were raised Roman Catholic, we never bothered to read the Old Testament. You know, I mean, it was there, but it was the Old Testament. I think subconsciously that's the way we thought about it. Protestants learned all those Bible stories. We were too busy. We learned doctrines. The Bible was just the footnote that supported the dogmas. The important thing was, what does the church teach? So you get these, and you get it from policymakers all the time. The same questions are raised, all those very, very sort of, you know, basic questions. And the democracy one is the one that's brought up all the time. Let me start, therefore, by not answering it in the intellectual or theological fashion, because you can simply argue that Muslims are like everybody else. You have Muslims who see democracy as a good thing, and you have Muslims who do not see it as a good thing. You have Muslims who see democracy as nice, but it's not part of their tradition, and Muslims who believe that it can be very much part of their tradition. You have Muslims who certainly look the way Jews and Christians do, and in effect would say, well, you know, in the past, our religion was used to justify divine right kingdoms, to justify feudalism, and times change, and now it can be, our religion is used to justify democratic forms of government. So you've got a variety of positions out there. But one of the things that's important is, what do Muslims really believe and want? You see, it's, you know, if you have a group of Catholic theologians who say, this is the only thing Catholics believe, and then you do a survey of people who go to church, and 80% of them basically believe and practice something else, you can't just say, well, somehow they're not Catholic, we're going to rule that out. If you do, you buy into a certain definition of a religion, and who has that absolute authority, you know, to define that religion. And so when we actually look at majorities in the Muslim world, we find out that, for example, when you ask majorities of Muslims, what do they admire about the West? And something that they admire and would want for themselves, it's our rule of law, accountability, transparency, if you will, right of the people to select their rulers. All of those things are there. If you ask Muslims if they were writing a constitution, what would they put in a constitution? They immediately talk about putting freedoms in there. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc. Despite the fact that many of their governments don't go in that direction. Despite the fact that many of their elites, their power elites, if you will, don't go in that direction. So that direction is there. On the other hand, naturally, the question comes up because when you take a look at the Muslim world, only 1 in 4 Muslim majority nations have democratically elected governments. And even where you have elections, they're often fairy tale elections. Ben Ali, a number of years ago, won by 99.91% of the vote. It's remarkable. Was crestfallen when he dropped to 95. Mubarak in the last elections came in at an all-time low. I think it was 88% of the vote. I mean, what do you do at that point? You definitely have to round up the opposition. There's a threat there. I mean, so the reality of it is when you actually look, naturally people would be cynical, and therefore people want to say, well, it's really their religion or their culture. The fact is, when you ask majorities of people who see themselves as religious and who see religion as an important force in their life, they opt for, if you will, a more democratized political environment. However, there is a difference. Majorities of Muslims, and particularly those that we call the politically radicalized, potential politically radicalized in Gallup data is as follows. When we ask people, do you think 9/11 was justified? I just got to make sure this is not an emergency call. No, it's my sister-in-law, because I dial her number incorrectly most of the time. I happen to dial her automatically. She's right next to my executive assistant. So then she goes home and sees the damn telephone number and then calls me and says, is there anything wrong at home? And I have to say, Sue, I really didn't want to call you. So this gets me out of it. The reality of it is that when you actually deal with where Muslims are coming from on the ground, these key democratic notions of self-determination are there. But when you ask Muslims globally, what about democracy, 7%, who we call potential radicals. Why are they potential radicals? Because 7% of these voices that represent a billion voices in the world, 7% believe 9/11 was justified. Okay? They're not people who advocate ongoing violence and terror, but they believe 9/11 was justified. As compared to the 90 to 93% who believe it was not justified, even though among the 93% are critics of American foreign policy. But this 7% is very interesting in terms of understanding the issue of democracy and other issues in the Muslim world. Because number one, they're no more religious than the others. So they're not necessarily religiously motivated in their attitude. Number two, they're brighter, better educated, are more successful in their jobs, more optimistic about their future, but more cynical about the future of their country and their region. In terms of what? Intervention, invasion, and occupation by the West. So on the issue of democracy, while they, even more than the mainstream, believe that democracy is the way forward and relations with the West are important. They, much more than the mainstream, believe that'll never happen. They, much more than the mainstream, believe there's a double standard. The West is not out to promote real democracy. The only form of democracy the West is interested in promoting is a Western-guided form of democracy. Okay? But when you actually look, again, across the spectrum at what do people want for themselves, they want broader democratization. At the same time, majorities do not want a simple secularism as separation of church and state. Majorities in most countries want to see religion as part of the moral compass of their society. And so majorities will say that they want to see Sharia as a source of law. But what they mean by Sharia are entirely different things. That is, for many, Sharia means God's principles, values, and guidance. So it's like, I want Islamic values, the way some people will say, I want to see Christian values guide America. Now, it may be surprising to some of you to know that something like 54% of Americans believe that American law should be based upon, that American laws should be based upon the Bible. Okay, something like 54% of Americans. Okay? So for majorities, they don't want then a Western secularism, which they would see as excluding religion from public space. They see religion as important in terms of the development of their society. But what are the implications then here with regard to women and women's rights? Well, one of the realities in the Muslim world, as we know, there are a number of realities, but one is that in many parts of the Muslim world, women are second-class citizens. Okay. It's a very diverse picture, but there are places where women are second-class citizens. There are places where women are clearly not just second-class citizens, but are oppressed. Another reality is that Islam, like all the world's religions, began in patriarchal societies, and therefore the tradition, the theology, and the law is the product of the good old boys, i.e. it's the product of the patriarchs. Theology and law in Islam, like theology and law in Christianity, in Judaism, etc., is primarily developed, in a patriarchal society, by people who embody the patriarch, and by people who are males historically. And in many parts of the Muslim world, you continue to have very strong force of patriarchy functioning, as well as local custom. An example of this would be Afghanistan. You know, a lot of people block out because it's convenient. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. That a significant number of women in Afghanistan, particularly outside of the urban areas, in the rural and village areas, okay, choose to cover themselves. Now, we can argue why they choose. You know, are they culturally, etc. But they are living in a society where this has been a long custom going back generations. They grew up in a society where these cultural values are the prevailing cultural values, and so they are conditioned by those values. Well, in many parts of the Muslim world, you have very diverse attitudes, but patriarchy is still there. I emphasize the diversity because keep in mind that if you really look at the Muslim world, if you go from North Africa to Southeast Asia, first of all, when it comes to women's modesty, women dress very differently. In Saudi Arabia, women are fully covered. Underneath that cover may be the most modern fashion, but they're fully covered and separated in public space. They don't drive cars. In other parts of the Muslim world, women wear a sari. In Pakistan, body fully covered. In Bangladesh, sari showing midriff. Okay? For your arch ultra-conservative Saudi, that's known as nudity. I was once accused in Saudi Arabia by an Egyptian fundamentalist of showing slides of nudes on a previous trip to Saudi Arabia, which I thought was absolutely fascinating because A, I don't usually show slides, and B, I kept thinking in Saudi Arabia, first of all, I don't have slides of nudes. Don't come up after, I only have them on DVD. No. But I kept thinking, and then he's accusing me of Saudi, and I kept thinking, what is it? Because I was going around giving lectures, and he was sort of following me around. And then I realized on a previous trip, they had asked me to lecture on Muslims in America. And I borrowed some slides from a friend of mine, and some slides I had of Islamic centers. And in one of the Islamic centers, you had some Bengali women in saris with their midriff showing. He never said that. He just said they were nude women, okay? Now, women not only dress differently across the Muslim world, but depending on the country, they hold different occupations. In some, more restricted occupations. In other, they can hold the same occupations as men. In some Muslim countries, they can be elected president of the country. There is a diversity there, and things are moving. What do we know on the ground in terms of the situation or the conditions? Education and employment opportunities have increased remarkably in the Muslim world. In some countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others, women are among, in some institutions, the majority, and in fact, the best students. You actually have the same situation we had when we went co-ed in the U.S. When I went to Holy Cross, it was the first year it went from being a boys' college, wasn't really a men's college. After you taught the men in the first year, you realized they were boys, to a co-ed college. And the reality of it was, you discovered 4 or 5 years later, once you were on the interviews committee for admission, that actually we had to juggle the standards a bit, because if we simply went by the academic excellence of those that applied, we'd have too large a proportion of women. Well, you run into that in some Muslim countries. So in a number of Muslim countries, you've got universities, you've got women who are getting first-rate educations, and you've got women who more and more are moving into the professional sectors. In other Muslim countries, there's an attempt to restrict that. In some Muslim countries, you have women now who are seen as religious authorities, for not only for women, but for others, and you have some women who are and/or are being trained to actually be muftis. Okay, you have women who clearly lead prayer. I'm not talking about mixed prayer, although that does occur. That's very marginal. But what about attitudes with regard to women, equality, job, education? Again, if you look at who speaks for Islam, we've got the data spelled out there. It's also in a more abbreviated form in my new book, Future of Islam. Majorities of men and women, obviously in many countries, more women than men, but majorities of men and women, even in a country like Saudi Arabia and in Iran, believe that women should have equal citizenship, equal opportunity to education, equal opportunity to a job that they're qualified for, and in many instances, holding senior positions in society. Why don't they? Again, we have to look at the nature of the society, the nature of the government dealing with this political issue, the nature of the establishment, the nature of the conservatism in the country, and the nature of the religious leaders in the country. I was discussing a particularly well-known, globally known Muslim leader who has some interesting reforms on women. For example, he believes in equality of women, the way I just stated it, and 4 out of 5 of his children, although he's banned from the United States, 4 out of 5 of his children have gotten PhDs in the US and the UK. But on another issue, I was talking to this reporter, and she said, but look at his position is still so conservative on the other issue. And part of what I said to her, again, if you take the human condition, I said, this is a man in his 80s. Think of when he was educated. Think of how many years he's lived. Think about his whole process. It's amazing that he's even come to some of these broader issues. But on some of the other issues that he'd remain more conservative, on certain of, if you will, the more narrow religious issues, like whether or not, women can lead prayer, I said, it's not surprising. That's going to have to move to another generation. So majorities on that issue fall into place. How about the issue of non-Muslim minorities or religious pluralism? We know that the issue of discrimination, violence, destruction of villages at times, churches and mosques, one has to say it's a two-way street. Nigeria has had destruction of a lot of churches and killing of Christians, but it's also gone the other way. I just want to bring that out in some context. But we know that religious pluralism is an issue in many Muslim countries, in Pakistan, in Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Iran, Iraq. And sadly, not as bad historically, but sadly raising its head at times in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. So you've got the challenge of pluralism. What we see among reformers is reformers arguing more and more and attempting to redefine the whole notion of religious pluralism. As many of you know, and I'll try to end this at about 5 minutes so there's enough time for questions and answers. As many of you know, traditionally in Islam, you had the notion that Jews and Christians were people of the book, and then it was extended to other religions. And that meant that if you paid a poll tax or a head tax, that you could practice your faith, be governed by your religious leaders. Did that mean secondary citizenship by modern standards? Yes. But what did it mean in its own times? Well, compared to Christendom, it was looking pretty good to an awful lot of people. It didn't mean that Muslims always lived up to it, but that in many contexts, certainly as compared to Christendom's approach, which was that Jews and Muslims had no place, and that even other Christians who were seen as heretics or schismatics, really had no place. That traditional notion was fairly forward-looking. In a modern state where you have equal citizenship, in increasingly in a globalized world, and in states which more and more become both more religiously and ethnically and nationally plural, obviously, from my point of view, this notion has to be reinterpreted. And indeed, you see Muslim religious leaders arguing about this. Not that all of them agree, but you see them arguing over the issue of religious pluralism, as indeed, I would argue, it existed within Roman Catholicism. In fact, when Vatican II accepted that document, who were the writers of that document? Anybody know? What country did they come from? The U.S. There were primarily two Jesuits from the U.S., which itself tells you how forward thinking on the issue of religious pluralism came from theologians who were dealing with the reality of themselves being a minority. And that's why some of the best work on broadening the notion of religious pluralism in Islam comes from Muslim scholars here or Muslim scholars overseas who studied here, like the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, or like Nurkolis Majid in Indonesia, etc. So we see that movement to, if you will, a more robust religious pluralism. But the forces against that religious pluralism still remain strong, as they do even in terms of religious pluralism within Christianity, if you distinguish between ultra-conservative and fundamentalist on the one hand, and mainstream Protestants and Catholics. You know, the problem, I'm going to go on a little bit longer, but I'm enjoying this. The problem that I have with a lot of mainstream Jews, Protestants, and Catholics is what we like to do at a certain point is really know that we're right and define our tradition that way. And so when somebody wants to say something, we always sort of say, no, kind of like, this is what my tradition's about. We present the liberal side, while we look down upon the conservative side of somebody else. And that isn't the case. And we've seen it come back to bite us, because whereas, for example, Roman Catholics celebrated if you will, the liberation of Vatican II on a number of issues, including religious pluralism, there's been backsliding. You know why? Because you have a whole legacy, among other things, of a tradition, of an interpretation of Scripture, okay, that for centuries was exclusivist religiously, or tended to be exclusivist, tended to believe if I'm right, you're wrong, tended not only to believe that I have the straightest path up the mountain, but I've got the only path that's going to make it to the top of the mountain. And there are permutations of that that keep raising their head. I was talking to a very well-educated Catholic who also is a senior corporate executive in New York, and talking about a Filipino priest who asked me what I did for a living. And I mentioned that I worked on Islam, and I thought, well, I'll have a problem relating to this, coming from a very strong Catholic culture. And he said, I'm very interested. I said, well, I did a whole DVD series on Islam, and I'll give it to you for a discount. No, I'll give it to you. I said, would you be interested? He said, yeah. He said, because about 12 years ago, he said, in Manila, he said, my older brother came home and announced to the family he'd become a Muslim. He said, you can imagine what that meant. He said, so we've really had to deal with this. Now, I then spoke to this person, who happened to be also somebody I'm very close to, this Catholic with that profile I just gave you, who said to me, and I would hope that he would pray for his immortal soul. That's a pretty powerful, it's a statement that I grew up with. I would hope, because when you think what the implications are for that, it's not good enough that the brother has, found a faith that makes him a better person, a moral person, worships, God, etc., but still that exclusivist. So what those who push for a broader religious pluralism run into is the tension within society between, if you will, the reformers and the more conservative arch-conservative types. The arch-conservative types basically look and say, this is not acceptable. This is not an acceptable interpretation. You know, what you're doing is distorting the tradition. What you're opening it up to is a total devaluing of the tradition. Okay? If I could take a mid-level position to give you an example again from our Judeo-Christian tradition, it's like some Roman Catholics saying, you know, we don't want to become like the Protestants. That's why we have to be stricter, hold on to our dogmas, more dogmatic. Look at what's happened to them. The more they open up, they break into more and more groups, and then you've got the difference between a Unitarian and a high Anglican. You know, where do you go with that? One prays to God, the other thinks good thoughts. I mean, you know, kind of these characterizations, you know. And therefore, you know, and so it's not only the religious pluralism, it's the problems you have even when you talk about dialogue. Catholics were slow to come to in a religious dialogue, and then fast-tracked in some regards, now pulling back a bit, but very slow. And for some Muslims, it was more like, well, if I'm right, why are we getting together? You're going to try to convince me about your faith? Does it require, the dialogue require that I have to give up, you know, that which I believe in? And so there's a struggle there. On the one hand, you can have statements by the Grand Mufti of Egypt, which are very forward-looking, but on the other hand, to give you an example of the pushback from conservatives, in 2005, 300 members of the Ulama Council of Indonesia, this is not all of the ulama, but 300 members, issued fatwas declaring liberal thought, secularism, religious pluralism unlawful, banning interfaith marriage or participating in prayers with people of other faiths, okay? That is an exact profile of the Roman Catholicism that I was raised with. Late 19th, early 20th century, I wasn't raised in the late 19th century, but this is historical background. Late 19th, early 20th century, you had one papal statement after the other condemning what was called modernism. And that had not only to do with biblical criticism, it had to do with democracy, women's rights, etc. It was seen as leading to anarchy. Okay? And when I grew up, to become a Boy Scout and meet in the basement of a Methodist church, not in the church, in the basement of a Methodist church, under a Catholic scoutmaster, but in the basement of a Methodist church with Methodists that belonged, required some finessing, let alone to go to, you didn't enter a Protestant church, even for a wedding, unless you got permission. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that we have, you know, these tensions that exist. And finally, the issue of terrorism. On the issue of terrorism, the vast majority of mainstream Muslim leaders denounce it. The vast majority see bin Laden as basically an aberration. And the vast majority denounce the use of illegitimate, note my choice of terms, the use of illegitimate violence. And I would point out to you that we certainly as Americans, both patriotically and religiously, most of us, do not reject violence. Most of us reject the illegitimate use of violence, okay? And they denounce terrorism. Where there is a critical problem within mainstream Islam is over the issue of suicide bombing, particularly when it comes to Palestine. And applied to Iraq also, but particularly in Palestine. There you have a division among religious leaders. You have some religious leaders who simply say suicide bombing is suicide, suicide is condemned in Islam, full stop. And you have other religious leaders that say, no, Palestine is an exception, and they give reasons for the exception. They say that those who are suicide bombers are not people who have lost despair in God and given up their belief in God and are just a traditional suicide. They are people who are laying down their life, lacking weapons. They are using their bodies as weapons against those that have much stronger weapons, and they are doing it in an occupied territory, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a real division among mainstream Muslim religious leaders and debate over the issue of suicide bombing, again, which those who would support it in Palestine would not see it as suicide bombing. You know, they wouldn't even want to necessarily use that word suicide. In conclusion, what can we say about relations between the Muslim world and the West? This will be the shortest because we can do this in Q&A. On the one hand, Obama was brought in fresh air. Obama came in and even surprised people. On the one hand, Obama, I think, reflected the problem that we have in America with Islam. Think about a president who makes sure he doesn't visit a mosque. Think about a president who avoids referring to Islam. Think about a president who goes to Dearborn and has his people try to get his supporters in Dearborn who are wearing headscarves to move out of the way when a picture's taken. Think about a president who appoints some Arab and Muslim advisors and then backs away from them during the campaign because others kind of object to their political positions on the Middle East or that they were associated with Muslim organizations. And think about a president whose situation was such that Colin Powell had to say when he endorsed him that he had a problem with members of his own party who seemed to imply that there was something wrong with being, being a Muslim. So Obama comes in with his Cairo speech, with his speech in Ankara, and he sets out a new vision. He backs away from a past legacy as he put it out there, which was unilateral, which relied more on military than diplomacy. He demonstrates in Cairo that he understands Islam and Islamic tradition. There's a real fine handling of those sensitivities. And he also talks about the need to both support the state of Israel and its existence, but also he can talk empathetically about the plight of the Palestinians for decades and the need for a Palestinian state. And he says he wants to develop a new way forward. The question is where that new way forward is going. The question is, whatever the president's vision and however strongly he feels about it, where are we a year later? Some have argued, both Republicans and non-Republicans alike, that on a number of critical issues that he has slowed down on or backed off on. In fact, his policy is not much of a difference from the Bush policy. Others have said that it may not have been his, quote, his fault, but in effect, he may have inherited Iraq and Afghanistan, but here we continue to have not only troops on the ground, but even more troops on the ground in Afghanistan. On the Middle East, with regard to the Arab and Palestinian, many would argue that the situation doesn't look very good at all. On the other hand, I was part of a briefing recently, a White House briefing in which somebody talked about being excited about the possibilities. Well, unless they're talking to somebody, they've gone up on the mountain, at least from what one sees coming out of the region, it's hard to believe that either the leadership is ready to make that move or that the administration will be in a position to make that move. But minimally, what one can say is that if we're going to improve relations between the Muslim world and the West, there has to be less support for authoritarian regimes, more economic and educational support, more use of diplomacy than military. We have to use the clout that we have with U.S. aid to get our authoritarian allies to open up their societies more. That's not going to be easy, but we do provide. In some countries, we have enough aid to have leverage. The difficulty is that many people will say is, look, you ought to develop a strong civil society. The problem is most authoritarian rulers don't want a strong civil society. They don't want strong political parties, human rights organizations, you name it, unions. So I think that's going to be part of the ongoing challenge. And then, the final thing is that we do live in a world in which if there's another attack, things can get worse. Now, you see, it all depends on where you're sitting when you hear that phrase. We sometimes forget that. We know when we're sitting in America and we hear it, we think of, there's another attack here. Okay? And if you're sitting in Britain, if there's another attack here. But there are people who sit in the Muslim world and say, if there's another attack in our part of the world, i.e., if the U.S. were to decide that it had to go in a significant way into, I don't know where, Yemen and some other place, etc., it would raise issues again because we know that these are, the groundwork in a post-9/11 world and the sensitivities are such that, in fact, significant polarization exists. I don't think we're going to be out of the woods for the next 10 years. I think we can make some movement, but we won't be out of the woods for the next 10 years. And I'll end with this example. I always give speeches in which I talk about light at the end of the tunnel. All speakers do that. In the last few years, certainly in the last years of the Bush administration, I had real problems with that. I was just giving a talk at the University of Wisconsin, and I stopped my talk. And I just stood there for a while, and I think people thought I was having a heart attack. It's the longest pause I've had. And I said, I'm speaking to you, and in my mind, on second track, I'm thinking to myself, Esposito, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. If these people are bright, you just painted a scenario where if you try to pull something off at the end to be positive, they're going to think you're an absolute phony. Well, I think long term there is light at the end of the tunnel. But the question is whether or not, as somebody shouted in an audience when I repeated that phrase, long term, I see light way at the end of the tunnel. They said the question is whether or not it's a freight train coming right at you. Thank you very much. Take any questions you might have. Yeah.
Please wait for the mic.
We've got a mic here, right there.
First of all, thank you very much. It was a very enlightening talk. I'm with you on the parallels between Catholicism and Islam, certainly in a number of different ways. But what I'm wondering is concerning reform and the question of authority. It seems quite clear within Catholicism how the reforms could come about and how they could be established. Because there's a hierarchical authority, it's quite clear, it's explicit. Within Islam, especially within Sunni Islam, that doesn't hold. So what counts as a reform having been implemented or having taken place?
It's a very good question. I would point out something. People often say, but there's no pope in Islam. Well, the fact is, there's no pope in Protestantism. There's a pope in Coptic Christianity. There's no pope in Judaism. That's why we have all these different Jewish groups, from ultra-conservative, ultra-orthodox to conservative to reform, who have different opinions and at times who don't recognize each other's rabbis, etc. Now, we see that in Judaism. We see that in Christianities, but we don't see it as Christians if we belong to a denomination, because we often look at our own denomination and think, well, if I'm Presbyterian, within the Presbyterians we have diversity, but we have a certain sense of organization. I think that's where we have to look at Sunni Islam now. The way in which Sunni Islam is developing is that, in fact, you're talking about clustering. If you look historically at Islam, most Muslims, when they're born, if they say they're Sunni Muslim, they're not just Sunni Muslim, they usually belong to and followers of a particular law school. There were 4 great law schools, okay? And so in a way, when they say I'm a Sunni Muslim, they mean I follow the Maliki school or whatever, which means there are differences there, okay? In today's world, what it means is that, on the one hand, muftis are aware of this issue. If you look at the Aman message and if you look at Common Word, you will see an attempt by Muslims, both Sunni and Shia and of different persuasions, to try to work together on some common issues. But at the end of the day, and you'll also see suggestions about regional clusters. For example, in the United States, you have a Fiqh Council of America. In Europe, you have a Fiqh Council, which, by the way, I think it's still the case, which was amazing to me. Anybody know where the Fiqh Council of Europe is based? Take a guess. What country? The least one you'd ever think of. Ireland. In Dublin. What's it doing in Dublin? When I first heard about it, I said, what are you doing in Dublin when I went there? They just picked it arbitrarily, But you've got the Fiqh Council of Europe, and you've got discussions among ulama. What many of them are trying to do, like-minded, but keep in mind, even if you get like-minded, you're then going to have clusters of conservative, or more conservative reform. But to greater power, try to get clusters of muftis, okay? Because remember, a mufti's opinion is not binding on anyone. It's authoritative, but not binding on anyone. You can then select and choose to use that. It's like a little bit like in a civil court, going and getting one of the top scholars at Harvard Law School to give you an opinion, which you then present as an authoritative opinion. Whether or not somebody chooses that over another opinion is their choice. And so there's an attempt to make that move. That means that you're going to have this diversity. I think what many Muslim religious leaders realize, not all, is that you need to have that diversity. But that they also need more unity. That to be this divided becomes a problem, because then it's like a one-on-one. You've got a mainstream a mufti making a statement, and you've got a radical mufti. So the notion is it's going to be much more powerful if you can say, as with Common Word, for example, here are the people that signed for this. We got the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, we got the Grand Mufti of so-and-so, we've got this famous, So, but there's always going to be that diversity, Short term, I think there are going to be real problems. Because the other thing I want to emphasize is, please keep in mind that whether we're talking about democratization and that process, okay, which wasn't just, we always say it was like the Enlightenment, etc. It was the French Civil War. It was the American Revolution, and then a bloodier Civil War, okay? And the Enlightenment didn't do anything to enlighten those people that fought those wars. Also, it didn't bring about religious pluralism. The Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation led to holy wars, as it were, between Protestants and Catholics, So it shouldn't surprise us that when you look, there are going to be great diversity within the Muslim world, i.e. you're going to see conservatives and reformers denouncing each other. Some politely disagreeing, others saying, hey, you've gone too far. That's not a good Muslim position. Or that you're going to have people, denouncing others as kuffar, as unbelievers, as attempting to silence them, etc. As one Grand Mufti said to an American Muslim who's written a lot, scholar, on democracy, he called him to him in another country, and he said to him, you've really got to stop writing on this. The stuff you're saying about Islam and democracy. Parenthetically, this Grand Mufti then came to espouse Islam and democracy a couple of years later. He said, you can't write on that. And the guy said, well, I'm an academic. I have to write on it. This is what I do as a profession. And the guy was also a religious leader too. And in frustration, note how global communications, this is somebody who's never left his country, at least not for like maybe 80 years. In frustration, he said, I don't understand. The Pope does it all the time. He calls in a theologian and says, stop writing. They stop writing. He said, I'm asking you to stop writing. You're saying no. So these tensions, are there. Even within, and let alone in an Islam where, the question is, who's your mufti? It's like, who's your rabbi? Jews can pick their synagogue and their rabbi. Protestants can do the same thing. Catholics have only begun to do that. We Catholics were raised with the idea that, no, you're born in a parish. Even if you don't like the priests, etc., you have no right to pick your priest, your parish, or your bishop, as it were, move over the line, to another bishop. So in Islam, you've got that diversity is both a strength, but it's a weakness. Yeah, next. Yeah. Yes?
I know it's very well used Judeo-Christian, traditional Judeo-Christian books, but in fact it has to be Judeo-Christian Muslim or Islamic books, those traditions, with alterations. A couple of more comments about women and modernity and democracy. You did say that democracy and modernity for Islamic world and for other worlds means different things. In my book, I actually compare the democracy in Islam, in ideal Islam, with socialism. So, democracy could be different things. About women. Women were traditionally educated, actually. And it is tradition of women, female imams, who would be segregated, absolutely isolated from political actions, but yet dedicating their life to prayer, to accompanying the dead, to welcoming the born, to hold the... so, intellectual tradition in early Egypt, early 20th century Egypt.
Provided that. I have to end you there because you're getting very Catholic. You got three things in one. So with Trinitarian. Let me answer what you said. Otherwise, on the democracy issue, John Vole and I did a book called Islam and Democracy. We spent the whole first section reminding Westerners that there are many forms of even Western democracy and even the relationship of church and state in Western democracy. We'll often look and say, but Islam doesn't want to, some Muslim societies don't want to separate religion from sort of social life or public life. Well, the fact is, if you look at the UK and Germany and a number of other countries until recently, like Norway and Sweden, religion, played, more of a role. You're right about the traditional role in some Muslim societies of women, but a good deal, as you know, a good deal of that history winds up getting sort of suppressed or forgotten. You wind up with a kind of amnesia towards that part of the legacy of the tradition, which in fact, in particular in Egypt, is now being resurrected. I got to go to some other people, but we can, yeah.
I have a question just regarding the path towards, like you compare it to Catholicism, where it's going to be this slow path towards reform and democratization. Do you see the issue of terrorism, especially as it's been in the last 10 years or so, as sort of a speed bump in this long process, or something that has a potential to completely throw off the entire progression?
It's a serious speed bump, but the point is, and I'm not trying to play down the terrorism thing. I mean, I teach on global terrorism. I'm an advisor to the EU on this issue. But when we talk about the phenomenon of terrorism, remember, of the 1.5 billion Muslims, it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1%. So, we've really got to, get that a little bit in perspective. It is an issue, in the sense that religious extremists, particularly if, this is why it's important that we deal with the conditions that create a situation that's ripe for recruiting people to extremism. Because if you've got authoritarian and repressive governments, if you've got situations of great sort of injustice, and if those governments in what they're doing are supported by foreign powers, then they do become the far enemy. And so not only is the far enemy in danger in terms of terrorism, but you're now developing a justification in the mind of those who become terrorists that in fact they are resistance fighters. They are freedom fighters. And then the use of religion to legitimate that, takes on if you will, a legitimating kind of form. And so that's why, for example, that's why it's very important to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli problem. It is a threat, and I think more and more Muslim religious leaders realize that it has to be taken on. I'm not going to compare this at all quantitatively, but I would say psychologically, for some Catholics and Protestants, they do not want to face the extent to which, because it's a much smaller problem, the extent to which allowing yourself to be totally anti-abortion. It's okay to be totally anti-abortion, I'm not denouncing that, but to the point where you really kind of turn away when it comes to abortion clinic bombing or killing somebody and just say, well, that's really too bad, and I wouldn't advocate it, but you shouldn't be surprised that happened, and really those are only 5 people compared to so many people. That becomes a kind of slippery slope, because there's kind of an implication that if a situation is that bad, then all bets are off. And that's exactly what terrorists wind up saying. Terrorists wind up saying if a situation is really that bad, then you may have to kill non-combatants. Or, as we would use the phrase, in legitimate form, quote, collateral damage may be necessary. Or, as people said after 9/11, look, just war is a remnant of the past. This is a new form of warfare. Just war is out. International law on torture is out, etc. And the same thing is here when you're legitimating stuff in the name of religion. Mark Juergensmeyer has a book called Terror in the Mind of God, which deals with this issue across religions. Yeah.
I was glad to see that I think you did present some light at the end of the tunnel and some sense of the reform movements within Islam and the opportunities that creates for better relationships between the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world. What is discouraging in this view is with so many authoritarian governments in the Islamic world, that's just another inhibition and obstruction for the reform movements. And if you think about that in sort of a quick way, I mean, it seems kind of hopeless.
Yeah.
Not because of what's going on in Islam, but because of the governments. And can you say anything about that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and one of the sad things is, by the way, while there was an opening towards democratization, I always say it wasn't that they opened the door, they cracked the door open in the late 1980s and 90s, because there were major economic problems. You had elections in a number of countries. In fact, these authoritarian governments have pretty much slammed the door shut. Or what they do in Egypt and other countries now is they have what one might call fig leaf democracy. They create a democratic facade, so they hold elections, or they say, civil society. That's right. That's why my country in the last year has doubled the number of civil societies. But what they don't tell you is, in a country like Egypt, it's government-regulated, non-government organizations. So the government decides what civil societies are legal. The government can disband them. The government decides the election laws. If they don't like the outlook, they can declare the election to be redone. They can change the laws again. In some countries, they become royal civil societies. And so there's a real problem. What compounds it and makes it depressing is that Western governments, for many reasons, wind up supporting these people. You just had, if you hear your news today about Kyrgyzstan and the government turning on people, there have been demonstrations against the government since March, okay? But what the news stories will tell you is it's also an ally of ours because we count on them because that's where we have bases to fight in Afghanistan. Now, to what extent, what do we do about Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, et cetera? Do we say it's in our national interest? And then if we turn the other way, that's been our track record when it comes to Egypt, when it comes to Tunisia, when it comes to, you can go on and on and on, Sudan is bad now because Sudan isn't what we like. If Sudan developed kept an authoritarian profile, but profiled itself a little bit more like Egypt, but if the ruler were authoritarian, etc., and our interest was in it, Sudan would be our ally. And so one of the nuts to crack is how do you deal with that, And also, I didn't hit at this, and I know this can be controversial. That some people don't like it, but the reality of it is there's not going to be any movement on Palestine and Israel until we have an administration that's willing to go really far. The problem is, I think President Bush meant well in his second term when he said, I'm going to, really work on the Middle East. I think Obama certainly did. But at the end of the day, unless Obama's got a card up his sleeve that we're not aware of, how he could have promised significant movement and in his first term, given the reality of our Congress, okay, given the reality of our domestic politics historically, given the reality of now facing elections in 2010 and 2012, and given the reality that in order to do it, it means playing hardball, not just with the Palestinians, but with the current government, and really playing hardball. I was talking with somebody recently who said, well, I see some really positive signs there with regard to working with Netanyahu's government. And one of the arguments brought up is, well, you had people, other leaders like Rabin and others who ultimately turned out to be able to bring peace. But you look at Netanyahu, when he was first made prime minister during Clinton's time, he showed what his true colors were. And I remember an assistant secretary of state kidding him and saying, because he was going to deal with Netanyahu, you're going to have a real headache. And he said, yeah, but he's promised that he's really going to work with us. Well, he never really did, okay? Now you look at him, and you look at who his foreign minister is, and you look at the people that are pressuring him. You look at his position on the settlements, okay? We're not even talking about disbanding illegal settlements. We're just talking about freezing. Not only what he did on the settlements, the fact that he comes in the middle of this whole thing, in which he's got problems, and in which he's got problems with what happened with Biden, comes to New York and makes the kind of unequivocal statement he made on Jerusalem when he's going to meet with the president. And then there's the big complaint that the president turned a cold shoulder. Okay? And there's been no talk almost in our media about the question of the lack of proportionality in the 10 Israeli strikes recently. Okay, so I'm not saying that Israel doesn't have a right to strike back when it is struck, but that lack of proportionality, unless the president's going to deal with that, unless we're going to have an administration that says to the Palestinians, any killing of non-combatants, whatever, defines, okay, it's out, but says the same thing to the Israeli military, okay? No exceptions, okay? Unless we deal with that, unless we have an administration that on something like the war with Hezbollah in Gaza, okay, says a curse on both your houses, but says a curse on both your houses. Not sits back and says nothing, as happened with regard to Gaza, and in fact delivers cluster bombs in the last days of the war. We can't, now Obama didn't do that, but what I'm trying to say is this is part of the reality that's out there, and that's where what I worry about is that the window's going to begin to close. There are still an awful lot of people in the region. He has a lot of cachet as a person, but I think in terms of our policy, that window is closing, and maybe there'll be a miracle. I think that's about it. I think we're out of time.
Talk about, obviously, but we are unfortunately out of time. So
Yeah.
please join me in